Danny Kruger, Conservative MP. Before that, you were an advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. You were elected in 2019. A pleasure to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about faith, which clearly is an important part of your life. Can you tell me when faith became an important part of your life?
Well, yes, it was in my 20s. I grew up in an atheist home, but I always felt that wasn't quite adequate. And I mean, it's a personal journey that everybody makes, but for me, the tipping point, as it were, was reading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, which is a great apology for the Christian faith. And all I can say is that I began the book as a non-believer, and I ended it as a believer. And that was I was 28, I think, and I've never doubted it since.
And what form does it take? Practical form? Do you go to church? You pray every day? You read the Bible? Tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a practicing Christian, and I have a personal faith. I think it's important to say, I think everybody has a faith of some sort or other. Everyone has their view of what's going on in the world, what we're here for, and they might think there's nothing out there except themselves, but that even they bring their values to their life. And I think it's important to honour and respect the freedom of religion, which includes the atheist religion, and to say that it's perfectly acceptable and in fact a good thing that we have a diversity of religious views represented in our public life, as long as none of us attempt to impose our views on others. And I think that's always the challenging point when you think something's right, whatever you believe, to be respectful of others, and that's the line that we always have to try and walk.
Okay, let's talk about something controversial, viewed as controversial. In a parliamentary debate, you said this: they think that women have an absolute right to bodily autonomy in this matter, whereas I think in the case of abortion, that right is qualified by the fact that another body is involved. It provoked some outbursts in the Commons at the time. How did that make you feel?
Well, I regretted being misunderstood, but you've got to own what you say, and you've got to own the reaction. No, you can't blame other people for not understanding what you were saying. Abortion is regulated by Parliament, not by the courts, which is why the US has had such an awful culture war for so long. We've regulated it through a parliamentary bill going back to the 1960s. And as a result, I think we've got a good balance. We can argue about what the terms should be for at which abortions become acceptable or not, but that point is something that Parliament regulates. I think it's the right basis of our law.
So we've talked about the response in Parliament, but did you experience hostility in, let's say, real life after you made those comments?
Well, a lot of people were very distressed, and I really sympathise, and I apologise for the distress that I caused if people had misunderstood what I was saying. And as I say, I take responsibility for that misunderstanding. I did seek to clarify, and I hope that satisfied people. But yes, there was all sorts of, a lot of very angry correspondence, activity in the media, and some people locally making their views felt, which is totally right, and that's democracy, and in a sense, I honour it, and it's given me an opportunity to engage with a lot of people, actually. So while I regret the distress that I caused, and I regret being misunderstood, and I had no intention of causing any.
Let's talk about another area which you are campaigning against, I suppose, because there is, or it feels like there's an increasing momentum. If you look at opinion polls, if you look at MPs and the number of those speaking in favour of medically assisted dying.
Yeah.
Your mum is Prue Leith from the Great British Bake Off. She takes a different view to you. So let's quote your mum. I just feel it's my life, and if I want to end it, which I don't, by the way, I'm really keen on my life, but I would like to have the option. What's wrong with your point of view from your mum?
Well, so Mum and I have made a film, which is being broadcast this week, in fact, and in which we went around North America, so Canada and some of the American states where they've legislated for assisted dying. And I'm afraid those examples are the counter-argument to her point. And obviously I completely respect the idea that no one should get in the way of somebody who wants to end their life, but actually that is what we do. If somebody's standing on a cliff edge or on a bridge trying to throw themselves off, we do try and stop them. We don't say it's your absolute autonomy to end your life. We think that it's a bad move to commit suicide. Her point is that there are people, in terrible physical distress and pain at the end of life who should be allowed to have a doctor administer lethal drugs to them. I think, while I totally understand it in those cases, it's impossible to draw a line that wouldn't also mean that we put at risk many vulnerable people, the mentally ill, the disabled, the lonely, the people who are terrified because they've just had a terrible diagnosis. And that's the evidence from Canada and elsewhere, that you find many vulnerable people being drawn into an assisted death when their families look back and say, why did that happen? It should not have happened. And we know that people who might feel suicidal when they have a diagnosis, a few months on, once they've received the care that they need, change their mind. It would be too late if we'd allowed them to kill themselves. And finally, the anxiety and the terrible legitimate fear that we all have about physical agony at the end does not have to happen. We are now so well advanced with what's called palliative care, end-of-life care. People should not be dying in terrible physical agony. And what we need to be doing is putting all our political energy and much more public money into palliative care. And the government has now legislated to make it an NHS service for the first time. That's progress in my view, and that's where we should be putting our energy.
I mentioned that the momentum seems to be going in the opposite direction. Do you think it's possible to halt that momentum? What can you do to halt it?
So I think it's true, and there is a tide in our culture which is increasingly about individual choice and freedom, as if that's the only value that we have, and that it's irrelevant what wider obligations you have or that people have to you. I regret that trend. I think it's harmful to our society to say that the only thing that matters is individual choice and freedom, as if we're not social beings. But yes, it is true to say the tide is running against us on this topic, but just for now it is. And frankly, it's been running against us for 100 years. Polls always show that people, if you ask them the question, should people be allowed to have an assisted death when they're in terrible physical agony at the end, then yes, people say they do. But every time it comes to Parliament, and it came before Parliament in your day, Gloria, every time it comes, Parliament votes against it, because the more people think about it, the more they actually study the topic and think about the implications of what we might be doing here, the more they understand what it actually means, then the more they change their mind. And I think that's the same. In fact, I know it's the same for the general public. There's a high, yes, I believe in it, the headline poll. But if you actually present them what it means, what the law would involve, including in these other countries where it's legal, people with anorexia and eating disorders, the mentally ill, being qualified and getting an assisted death or euthanasia, children getting it. The implications of what we're talking about are so extreme that when you present these to people, they think, hang on, maybe there's a problem in principle with the state deciding that somebody's life is, they'd be better off dead. And I think that is a realisation that people will get once the evidence is presented to them.
Do you feel confident that in our lifetimes, medically assisted dying will still not be legal in this country?
No, I'm not confident. I've got a great fear that it's going to happen and that we will regret it and it'll be too late to undo it, which is, I think, what's happening in Canada. I do urge anybody interested in this to study what's happening in Canada. It's a very simple problem. Once you've conceded the right to some defined group, people at the end of life, with the so-called safeguards to stop anybody else getting it, all you're doing is erecting a barrier to a human right that is steadily eroded. And that's what happens in every country. So you just don't start. Because it's fine for the wealthy and the autonomous and the people who are in totally sound mind, loving family around them, who support their decision. No question about money. You can see it's fine for them. But these disabled, lonely, vulnerable, marginalised people who are the victims of this in other countries, we have those too, I'm afraid. And those are the people I worry about.
So you're doing this documentary, which is going to air this week, with your mum. When you're round at your mum's or she's round at yours, and I don't know if you have a glass of wine together and you're having dinner together or whatever, do you end up arguing with it? Yeah,
well, no, we do. I mean, we don't argue badly. I mean, this has been we've had this conversation, been having this conversation for years and years. She's completely impossible. She won't change her mind, in spite of all my all the obvious evidence. No, she's very committed to it, as am I. But I think the documentary shows this. It is possible to disagree well on these and all these matters. All these difficult questions. And part of the reason we did it was to show that I think we both think the more people think about it, the more they'll agree with our side. Because I'm right about that. Because the more people think about it, the more they don't like assisted dying. But she wants there to be momentum for this campaign. I want people to think about it properly. So we thought it was a good idea, but it's also a good idea to have the opportunity to show people disagreeing well, which we need more of in our country.
So just want to ask you about working for Prime Minister Boris Johnson before you were elected in 2019. You would obviously have worked with Dominic Cummings, his chief aide. That was a spectacular falling out of two people who worked so closely together. Could you see that coming?
Well, so I worked with them up to 2019 when they were getting along. I wasn't there for the fallout.
Yes, that's true.
I wasn't in number 10.
It was all harmonious when you were there.
So, I mean, I'm a very old friend of Dom, and I'm a huge admirer of Boris as well. So I think it's a great tragedy that they fell out, because the two of them together were a great combination. Dom has the strategic vision, and as well as the ability to really get into the tactics of what's needed for a political battle, as he's obviously proved time and again. And Boris has the courage and the charisma, and again the vision to do what's necessary. And you know, Dom always says only Boris could have broken the logjam. Parliament as a whole was against us. You know, Boris was prepared to blast through that logjam, and with Dom helping set the strategy. So they were a very powerful duo. The problem, as I understand it from the outside, obviously COVID presented all kinds of strains on the government, but the great regret that I share with Dom Cummings about this, about the Boris Johnson government, is that there was a 2-point plan to Brexit. The first was to get out of the EU, and then the second thing was to use our Brexit freedoms to reform the British state, to undertake profound reform to the way Whitehall works and the way we are governed, to empower local people, to strip back the quangos and the bureaucracy, to restore parliamentary sovereignty, in fact, and to ensure that people could genuinely take back control of their country, which is about more than getting out of the EU. And I think it's what people were voting for. They were voting for a wholesale change, not just we don't like Brussels. They don't like London and Whitehall either, as you know. And it was that second stage that I don't feel we have yet fully delivered. That's our mission, and that's what Dom and Boris were, I think, put into power to do in 2019. They delivered half of it, which was the Brexit bit, the second half, which is the domestic reform. Obviously, other things have happened in public life in the last couple of years, but the need for that hasn't gone away, and that's what we need to do now.
You know Boris Johnson better than most of us. Do you think we'll see him in a frontline political role again? Do you hope we...
Really good question. I don't know. I don't know if we will or if we should. I think the decision for Boris is he going to... I mean, as I say, I think that what the country needs, and whether this is Boris, Liz, Rishi or somebody else, what we need to do is to reform the way we're governed and to put power in the hands of local people and support families and make Brexit real by getting back control of our borders. All of these really challenging and strategic changes. If Boris commits to doing that, then I would be delighted, because he brings so much. He's got all the courage and all the charisma that we need in our leaders. Whether he's prepared to do the policy work that I think we need is the question we haven't yet. He wasn't able to answer because he got derailed by COVID. But he's a great man. He is a historic figure who will always be a key part of the Tory story. And I'd love to see him back in some way.
Final question, which just came to me as we've been chatting, actually. We've just had what I think is a really interesting conversation about some controversial issues, but you've articulated why you hold those views in a very calm and considered way. Do you think being a man of faith will hold you back in terms of promotion? Maybe you want to take it away from you personally, but is it more difficult to hold those positions and move up the ministerial career?
So you tell me, Gloria. Maybe yes. I mean, on the face of it, yes, I think it is. I mean, we are naturally religious people, and we want people who share our religion. We like working with them, frankly, even though we talk about diversity, and we've got to hold on to the importance of diversity, as I was saying earlier. But, the religion of our culture at the moment, I'm afraid, is liberal individualism. It's not Christianity. So I'm not part of the, governing faith of our country at the moment. So that's probably a disadvantage to me. On the other hand, I hope people might see, as long as he's not trying to impose his weird Christian views on me, then I can admire the fact that he's got some beliefs and some values, which actually I kind of like, because they're about kindness, they're about, forgiveness, tolerance, and they're also about these institutions of family, neighbourhood, nation, the things that I think are important. And people might think, well, somebody who actually has some beliefs, even if they're unpopular and unfashionable, and isn't afraid of them, maybe should be listened to. But yeah, I think on the face of it, I would probably think it's more of a disadvantage to be a Christian in public life. That said, politics and Parliament is a perfectly tolerant place. I have had no grief from anybody who disagrees with me on this, and I think they think I'm eccentric rather than bad.
That was one of the most engaging political chats I've had.
Great.
Thanks,
Gloria.
It was really interesting.
Good.
It was really nice to meet you, Dan
Good.
Kruger. Thank you.
Thank you.